Hello and welcome to Views on News. I'm Jawad Tehami. After the recent withdrawal of the US-led foreign forces from Afghanistan and the takeover by the Taliban, the war-torn country plunged into an economic and humanitarian crisis. The funds were frozen, no sustainable economic and governance model was in place, which rattled the war-ravaged country to the core. Pakistan, being the immediate neighbor and bore the brunt over the years due to the power struggle among the world powers, tried to draw the world's attention towards looming crisis at the very outset. The country's leadership did not only provide humanitarian assistance, but also hosted international moods to urge the international community to help avert the economic and humanitarian crisis. More recently, Pakistan's National Security Advisor Dr. Moeed Yusuf, during his two-day tour to Afghanistan, met with some of the top leaders of the interim setup there. The objective of the visit was to discuss with the Afghan leadership the humanitarian requirements of the country and Pakistan's proposals for deepening economic engagement to overcome the current challenges Afghanistan is facing. The Taliban leadership assured the Pakistan's side that they won't allow Afghan soil to be used against any other country. A number of other issues, including transit, trade and economic ties and border management, were also discussed. And to talk more about this particular visit of Pakistan's National Security Advisor, Dr. Moeed Yusuf, I am joined by Air Vice Marshal retired Azher Hasan, senior analyst, who is joining me in the studio. Thank you very much for your time at PTV World. So how do you think this tour of the National Security Advisor is significant?
Thank you for having me on your show.
Okay. Mr. Hasan will play a report before going into further discussion. Okay. Let's watch this report regarding the National Security Advisor's tour to Afghanistan.
Delegation to Afghanistan. National Security Advisor led interministerial delegation to Afghanistan concluded its 2 days visit on 30th January 2022. The visit was an assertive expression of Pakistan's resolve regarding socio-economical support to Afghanistan in the current humanitarian crisis situation. During this visit, Moeed Yusuf, who heads the Afghanistan Interministerial Coordination Cell, called on Afghanistan's acting Deputy Prime Minister Mullah Abdul Salam Hanafi and acting Foreign Minister Amir Khan Muttaqi to discuss the current situation in Afghanistan. Moeed Yusuf also held delegation-level meetings with Afghan ministers and senior officials to overcome current humanitarian crisis. According to an official press release, both sides agreed to establish a national-level coordination mechanism for enhancing facilitation at border crossing points. They also agreed to initiate barter trade, modalities for which will be worked out immediately. Pakistan also offered Afghanistan capacity building and training support in multiple sectors, including health, education, banking, customs, railways, and aviation. Both sides also reiterated their commitment to the early completion of 3 major connectivity projects, including the Central Asia-South Asia Electricity Transmission and Trade Project, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India gas pipeline, and Trans-Afghan Rail Project, and emphasized their commitment to ensure peace and stability in both countries.
You watched that comprehensive report regarding the recent tour of Dr. Moeed Yusuf, the National Security Advisor of Pakistan to Afghanistan, and there were a number of things which were discussed between Pakistani leadership and the Afghan interim leaders over there, led by the Taliban. And to talk more about the significance of Dr. Moeed Yusuf's visit, I am joined in today's show in the studio, Air Vice Marshal retired Azher Hasan, who is a senior analyst, and on Skype I'm being joined by Mr. Stephan Ossenkopp. He's from Berlin, a geopolitical analyst and research fellow at Shiller Institute. Thank you very much for your time at PTV World as well. I'll begin the discussion with you. Mr. Hasan, how significant do you think this tour has been as far as the relationships between Pakistan and Afghanistan, especially after the Afghanistan's takeover by the Taliban is concerned?
First of all, let me thank you for having me on your show. As you gave a detail in your opening remarks, I think Pakistan's and Afghanistan's relationship is intertwined. Their destinies are tied together. It's been Pakistan's efforts ever since our relationship with Afghanistan improved that we must work together in harmony because we are neighbors, and we can harness the potential of both countries to maximize our economic outputs. Particularly in the recent past, as you are aware, after American withdrawal, we have seen that Afghanistan was left in the lurch. They had nothing to eat, there was no food, they have been destroyed completely in the last many decades, and there was no plan ahead. So it was virtually left to Pakistan to handle, and Pakistan, I think, did its best. They hosted a meeting of the OIC foreign ministers in the recent past, as you're aware. They had established a fund for that purpose. But significant inflow of humanitarian assistance is difficult internationally because of their concern, which have to be addressed. This visit of National Security Advisor was as a follow-up of that, because there was an interministerial commission which was formed, and National Security Advisor is heading that commission. So recently there was also some incidents which came up in the media, as you're aware, about the border incidents, as well as some attacks and cross-border attacks in Pakistan. So there was a need to discuss issues and settle. These issues are minor, and I'm sure the meeting has been very productive, as explained by both sides. And we can only get the details once they are available, but as both sides have claimed, the meetings has been very productive. And I'm sure these minor issues must have been settled.
The meetings had been very productive. I'll come back to you again for some other points to discuss. Mr. Ossenkopp, thank you for your time at PTV World as well. I'll come to you. There is an assurance by the Afghan leadership that the Afghan soil won't be used against any other country, and they will ensure it. Do you think the Afghan Taliban have got that capacity to ensure and fulfill this promise?
Well, of course, Afghanistan is a very complex country, and it's been the subject of attacks and wars, not only in the recent 2 decades under NATO, but also, of course, as basically the area where geopolitical fights have been fought for centuries between the British Empire and the Russian Empire, between Western forces and Eastern forces. So I'm not sure if the Taliban are in control of the entire country and all of its functions. But I think that Taliban have learned from recent developments and are now reaching out to the world community, including their neighbor countries, to basically reach stability. And the just mentioned visit by National Security Advisor Moeed Yusuf is a very, very model version of a step that countries can take to negotiate with the Taliban, basically saying that what you need so that security risks such as terrorism, drug trade, etc., refugee problems do not research in a major way is economic development. And so I'm very happy that the National Security Advisor brought up what the initial report already had detailed, the Central Asia, South Asia power project, which will link basically Central Asia to Pakistan, because without power, without electricity, you are living like in the Middle Ages. And there is also the gas project.
So Mr. Ossenkopp, sorry for the interruption. As you just mentioned that the Taliban don't have that very much power on the entire country over there in Afghanistan, but this promise was part of the Doha peace deal as well. They promised that the Afghan soil won't be used. In fact, the Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan won't allow any insurgent group or the terrorist organization to use Afghan soil against any other country. And that is what the assurance we have seen during Dr. Moeed Yusuf's recent visit to Afghanistan. So what do you think remain to be the options at the hands of the Afghan Taliban in order to ensure, because of course there are a lot of other range of issues which have been discussed during this tour, which include the connectivity, the transit and trade, but security remains to be the key for economic development and prosperity.
Absolutely, I agree. And I think that economic development and security are two issues that are that mutually influence each other. You cannot have, as you said, you cannot have economic development without security. That is why the security advisor in this week's interview in the Beijing Review said, we provided 15,000 security personnel to secure the China-Pakistan economic corridor. I'm not sure that under the circumstances, the immense humanitarian crisis, I mean, 97% of Afghan people are now going hungry. People are freezing to death in the winter. I'm not sure that under these conditions, if the humanitarian crisis is not immediately addressed, and not just by Pakistan, who's a brotherly country, but also by Western nations who bear responsibility for the situation, but also by economic powers such as Russia and China. I think only in this context we can guarantee that the security situation in Afghanistan is under control. I'm just saying that there are also other factors inside Afghanistan. I don't think that the factors of certain groups that are, for example, Islamic State or other radical groups that are also basically supported by the West or have been supported by the West in recent times via the opium trade, etc., via weapons deliveries, that they are not maybe a factor that are not entirely under control right now, but can be brought under control if the international community were to be serious to help Afghanistan overcoming this immediate crisis.
Okay, Mr. Ossenkopp, I'll take this very point. Mr. Hasan, what do you think what remain to be the options at the hands of the Taliban in order to ensure that the Afghan soil is not used against any other country? And that was actually the promise in the Doha peace deal as well.
Yes, I think they have to honor the commitments made to the international community as well as to Pakistan. Some of the demands that the international community had put forward earlier were that they must address the human rights issue, women rights issue, inclusivity in the government, as well as the Afghan soil should not be used. They have committed this and they ought to honor this. But I think for them to meet this objective, they will have to have support of the international community. They cannot do it isolatedly or by themselves. Unless the world also comes forward and supports them in many ways that they need, they will be able to honor their commitment. I think there's no way out. But if the world community does not help them, they may find it difficult to handle the situation on their own. Rather, if they continue to descend in the economic crisis that they're facing, a humanitarian crisis that the other groups may find emboldened and may take a bigger share. So I think there's a lot of stake involved in this, in particularly the region as well as the international community, to help Afghanistan get out of this situation.
Okay, I've been now joined with by another guest, Mr. Kamran Yousaf, senior journalist. Mr. Yousaf, thank you very much for your time at PDB World. We've been discussing the significance of Dr. Moeed Yusuf's recent visit to Afghanistan and assurance by the Afghan top leadership that the Afghan soil won't be used against any other country. We've seen a recent ceasefire between the Pakistani authorities and the TTP, Taliban Pakistan, and the Afghan Taliban happen to have brokered that deal. But that ceasefire was violated by the TTP itself. So what do you think, how Pakistan can impress upon the Afghan Taliban to take a concrete action against groups such as TTP, which have safe havens in Afghanistan?
Well, ideally speaking, Pakistan wants that all the safe havens or the sanctuaries established by banned Taliban Pakistan and other such groups should be eradicated from the Afghan soil. And this has been Pakistan's long-standing demand, even when the US-backed previous Afghan administration were in charge in Kabul. But of course, that the previous Afghan administration did not pay much heed. But since the Taliban takeover, the expectation was that they will take some kind of action, or at least deny such groups any space to target Pakistan or any other country. But since they took over, instead of taking action, they offered their good offices, the Afghan Taliban, to Pakistan to broker some kind of a deal. And it was because of those good offices, we saw a 1-month-long ceasefire between the TTP and the state of Pakistan. But since that ceasefire was over and we saw spike in TTP terrorist attacks in Pakistan, authorities in Pakistan are really worried that it appears that those groups operating out of Afghanistan are still using the Afghan soil. So in that context, of course, the Taliban leadership are repeatedly giving assurances. The worry is, of course, that Afghan Taliban are reluctant to take any action against the TTP. And that's
So
where,
Mr. Yusuf, where this reluctance comes from? What are the limitations at the hands of Afghan Taliban?
I think we have to understand the larger context. When Afghan Taliban were ousted from power after the 9/11 attacks by the US-led international forces, their leadership, most of them and their fighters, actually fled from Afghanistan, and some of them took refuge in the erstwhile tribal areas of Pakistan. And during that period, the TTP or the groups or the people who later formed Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan provided or hosted those Afghan Taliban leadership. And don't forget that the Afghan Taliban and the TTP also fought against the US-led foreign forces. So they have this connection as well. And the second aspect, that why Afghan Taliban are reluctant to take action against the TTP, because they fear that if they take action against the TTP, the TTP fighters may join Daesh Khorasan, which of course is posing immediate threat to Afghan Taliban. So the problem is very complex, and that is why the Afghan Taliban are trying to find some kind of a middle way where they can at the same time address Pakistan's concerns, but at the same time, do not antagonize or annoy the TTP, and that's where the real problem, comes in. But of course, the Pakistani
Mr. Yousaf, your point is well taken. I'll take this very point to Mr. Hasan. Mr. Hasan, do you think that they are reluctant in a way not to take a concrete action against the TTP in Afghanistan, the Afghan Taliban, just because they fear that they might go and join the Daesh or ISIS for that matter?
Well, it makes sense to some extent. But in my view, if they remain isolated and there is no support to them, there will be reluctance, of course. They need help. They need to stand on their feet to do something that they're required to do. So that is why I think I don't find there will be reluctance, because they have to prove to the world, unless they do it, there will be no support forthcoming. So they have to honor this, whatever the cost may be, particularly in this area that I'm talking about. What they feel handicapped is, like he also mentioned, that if they do take steps and there's no help, they will get alienated. They may join the other group also. But if they can stand on their feet, they have support, they have enough strength, I think they will not be reluctant to take.
So when it comes to fulfilling the promises, especially with the Pakistani authorities, do you think when the border management comes under discussion between both the sides, it could be a sort of a proof on the part of the Afghan Taliban in front of the Pakistani authorities, yes, look, this is what we have proven, we are doing, we are taking care of the border fencing as well. But as you alluded to the fact that in the recent past, we have seen a couple of incidents of certain elements uprooting the fencing along the Pak-Afghan border. So do you think that could be a precursor at the hands of the Afghan Taliban to go one step ahead and to show to the world that yes, we are doing this, and the next step could be ensuring that the Afghan soil is not being used against any other country?
Of course, these incidents which have taken place in the recent past, well, I won't like to say, but the world is perhaps not that much concerned about if something happens in Pakistan or Iran. But they would be concerned if something happens in their areas with their allies. But yes, it does signal that the promise of Afghanistan is not being met. They have to do something. They have to move forward to do that. But then I would like to re-emphasize that they are in dire need of help. If they have to struggle for life, I don't know how can they meet their promises. So there has to be humanitarian assistance on the national level. They have to find ways to do it. And I'm sure they will also be able to honor their promise. Some they can, the others perhaps they may not be able to do it without the assistance of the world.
Okay, Mr. Yusuf, what do you think? The border management also came under discussion between both of the sides, and a national coordination mechanism has been agreed upon by both the sides. Do you think, but before that we saw those incidents, there were a couple of elements uprooting the fencing along the Pak-Afghan border. Then DGI SPR in his presser said that it would go as planned. Then we saw the statement coming from the Interior Minister, Sheikh Rashid. He said that the remaining part of this fence would be completed with the consent of the parties on the other side of the border, because they are our brothers as well. Do you think there could be some sort of convergent point between both the authorities, that the remaining fencing is also completed as planned?
I think it is too early to say that whether there is a convergence between the two sides, because even the previous Afghan governments repeatedly opposed this fencing because they feel that it divides families living on both sides. But of course, that is not a valid point. Pakistan feels this region, we have seen over the last 2 decades how it has become, the safe haven for all kinds of militant groups and different militant outfits. So they frequently take advantage of the rugged and porous border between the two countries. So Pakistan's decision to build this fence is part of the larger objective to regulate the movement of the people, trade, and most importantly ensure security on both sides of the border. And I think on this Pakistan is not going to back down. The only question is how Pakistan can convince the other side. Till now, it appears that Pakistan is trying to play down what happened over the past few weeks, certain incidents where Taliban soldiers tried to uproot or destroy the portion of fencing along the border. But Pakistan suggested that those were localized incidents. At the leadership level, there is understanding that this fencing is important. But I think it is an issue because the perception or the view from the other side is totally different, because off and on, they also raise the question of this Joran line, although that is not a relevant point because this border between Pakistan and Afghanistan is considered as international border. All the other countries also recognize this. But within Afghanistan, there are elements who do not subscribe to
there are
things.
certain elements within Afghanistan you think are not in the favor of completing this fence, and they think that this is to divide people, which actually has been negated very categorically by DGI SPR Major General Babar Iftikhar, that this fence is the fence of peace and it's not about to divide people. Mr. Ossenkopp, do you think this fence has that significance when it comes to countering terrorism and the cross-border infiltration? Because over the last many decades, we have seen that the influx of refugees at point number 1 and point number 2, the infiltration of the insurgents from Afghanistan to Pakistan, which actually inflicted a huge damage in form of horrific terrorist incidents for a decade or so. So do you think there could be a realization at on the part of Taliban that it is good for them as well, and it is good for the Afghan people as well? It doesn't only serve the purpose of Pakistan.
Well, I must say that the issue has been, I agree with Mr. Baig and Mr. Yousaf that this issue, it's too early to tell, but I think most of the arguments are already exhausted. There are some people who are for the fence. I heard about this incident and I saw some reports. I don't know much of the background. Some people are against the fence, and both have their own reasons, and most of the reasons are logic and reasonable in and of itself. But I think borders cannot be controlled entirely, whether it be the Pakistan-Afghanistan border or the other Afghan borders towards the Central Asian countries, or any border. For example, basically you see the recent case, I don't want to sidetrack, but you've seen the recent case of Kazakhstan, for example, where 20,000 militants basically wanted to take over the country in a coup d'etat, and they somehow were infiltrated through either Russian borders or other borders because these borders cannot be controlled ultimately. Of course, this was beaten down. I mean, this was suppressed by the CSTO military forces. And there are always some short-term military solutions and security solutions to all of these things. But I think in the geopolitical analysts think mid-term and long-term. They think that this situation can only be controlled, as Mr. Bayi said, as long as a government is struggling for life and for its people, there is no solution in and of itself. And so I support what Prime Minister Imran Khan has said recently, that he will, of course, fight terrorism in all of its forms, but he wants to extend the China-Pakistan economic corridor into the greater region and have other countries such as Pakistan benefit from it. This will be the only solution. China calls it the Belt and Road Initiative. 145 countries are already participating. And only in Pakistan, they have now laid the groundwork, which is roads and railroads and energy, added 9 gigawatt of energy. But the next step will be the much needed industrialization and modernization in technology. Once Pakistan has that function, I think it can contribute much more to the security of Afghanistan and all other nations by being an exporter of technologies and of industrial goods that can be used to stabilize and give the entire population mid and long-term perspective.
So, Mr. Ossenkopp, Dr. Moeed Yusuf also highlighted the significance of early completion of these, some of the connectivity projects in which Afghanistan happens to be the stakeholder, that include the CASA 1000 and the TAPI and then the Trans-Afghan railway line. When it comes to border fencing, it happens to be of utmost importance and happens to be crucial in order to regulate trade specifically, and projects like these, like CASA 1000 and TAPI and Trans-Afghan railway project.
Am I to speak or who?
Yeah, Mr. Ossenkopp.
I'm sorry, yeah. I don't see a picture. I just hear the audio. So I was. Absolutely. I think that, for example, if you look at, I think Pakistan is a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. When these were formed in its initial form in the, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, there was a lot of insecurity. Where are the borders? There were a lot of military installations, and the situation was very, very tense. But then they agreed to retreat military installations and bring economic development to the borders. And from that developed all the natural gas lines, the oil projects, the cross-border modernization, industrialization projects. And since then, I think the Shanghai Cooperation Organization countries have made an enormous step forward. And nobody can now see any violent confrontation between, for example, China and Russia. They've become strategic partners. And so I think this is the way to go, basically not trying to use military hardware for the solution of any of the problems that are facing the entire region, but also seeing it in a global context. And I mean, I'm in Europe, I'm in Berlin. Everybody's talking now about war. The British are already in World War III mode. They are delivering weapons instead of, they think that is securing the interest of Europe to deliver weapons to Ukraine and punish Russia economically with more sanctions, basically explicitly saying, like the Foreign Secretary Truss, that they want to target the entire Russian industry. And that's exactly the wrong way. This is geopolitical thinking. This is fanning the flames of war. This is going to a situation where even nuclear and thermonuclear powers will be standing head to head in a showdown. So I think this there is no more security with more military, but only with stepping aside or going a step backwards and saying, what are the common interests of us and of our people? That is economic development.
Mr. Yousaf, I'll come to you. As we saw after the abrupt withdrawal by the foreign forces and the takeover by the Taliban, we saw the country plunging into economic and humanitarian crisis just because of the fact that the public spending was dependent on 75 to 80% public spending was dependent on the foreign aid, and there was no sustainable economic model in place, no governance model whatsoever in that country. Do you think Pakistan's steps in this regard when we see vis-a-vis regional connectivity and engaging the interim setup over there in Afghanistan into economic engagement and ties, it has that significance in order to make Afghanistan more self-sufficient rather than relying on the foreign aid for public spending?
Well, of course, Pakistan has a central role, given the fact that Afghanistan is a landlocked country. And in that sense, Pakistan is very vital. But I think the kind of challenges, the economic challenges Afghanistan currently facing, I don't think so that Pakistan can alone really mitigate the problems. The problems are huge. Pakistan can only facilitate, I think, the outside world and the other regional countries. But to say that Pakistan can alone really solve most of the economic challenges and the problems being faced by Afghanistan, I think it is a bit unfair and asking too much from Pakistan, given the fact, just to give you a little example, as you mentioned, that although the US and the other forces spent almost $2.3 trillion in Afghanistan for the last 20 years, but when they left, what we have now in Afghanistan, almost nearly 23 million people are facing food shortage. Children are, dying because of hunger and so many other problems. And also, there are no official banking channels are currently, existing inside Afghanistan, creating huge problems for people to do business. So on these issues, what are the hurdles? I mean, I've been speaking to Pakistani officials. They say that the local banks in Afghanistan are reluctant to do transactions because they fear that there will be U.S. sanctions. And when they say we talk to the U.S. officials, they say, no, we don't, or we didn't impose any sanctions. But the perception is that, since U.S. is very reluctant to open up and remove some of the restrictions, the business community, the banks over there, international banks, international organizations are really reluctant. So given these enormity of the challenges, I don't think so that Pakistan can alone really take up this challenge, and that is
your
why
point is well taken,
it is
Mr. Yousaf.
engaging with other countries.
So, Mr. Yousaf, your point is well taken. Mr. Hasan, what do you think? It speaks volume, at least, as Mr. Yousaf alluded to the fact that it's not only Pakistan that can do a lot of things alone for averting the humanitarian and economic crisis that Afghanistan is faced with at this point in history. But it is the responsibility of the international community to collectively come to the fore and do something about it. But it speaks volumes about the unwavering and unflinching support and the practical efforts which the Pakistani authorities are carrying out in order to help the Afghan brethren.
That's true. I think Mr. Yousaf very well alluded to this point. There are limitations, technical limitations as well as capacity limitations in Pakistan. And there is a huge support that is requirement for Afghanistan. A country which has virtually been destroyed over many years need a lot. And I think without world support, there will be a great challenge which alone Pakistan cannot handle. As far as within Afghan is concerned, there are groups, and I have this thing in my mind. In case the world doesn't come forward to help Afghanistan, in today's world, people need to realize in the world that any threat anywhere in the world or any instability in the world at any point becomes a risk for an instability anywhere in the world. So Afghanistan, if become unstable, this will also lead to some problem somewhere in the world. And the worst affectees are its neighbors. And Pakistan has already borne the brunt. We are still facing those challenges. We are doing what we can do. But I think this alone Pakistan cannot do. The world has to meet this challenge.
The world has to meet this challenge. Mr. Ossenkopp, when it comes to Pakistan vis-a-vis Afghanistan, over the last decades we have seen whenever a foreign power or an alliance comes into invade Afghanistan, it doesn't actually create problems for the natives over there, but also a direct impact happens to be on the immediate neighbors, including Pakistan and Iran as well. Pakistan has bore the brunt of the refugee influx and also cross-border infiltration in form of terrorism and huge losses to the Pakistan's economy in that context as well. Now, when we come to the role of international community, Pakistan is trying its best to urge the international community to come to the fore and do something about this humanitarian crisis and the economic crisis Afghanistan is faced with. And Pakistan's Prime Minister a number of times has urged the international community to separate the Afghan Taliban from the Afghan natives, to just let the Afghans have some peace and some prosperity and progress. So in this context, do you think it is Pakistan that has learned the lesson whenever an international invader comes in and it leaves the Afghan at their own without anything that is done much for them, and it leaves a huge vacuum for the people over there, and it again, not only by the dint of invasion but also by leaving a huge vacuum when they leave, and they leave at the wish and the whim of their own self, that creates a vulnerability not only for the Afghan natives but also countries like Pakistan.
Well, last week there was a United Nations Security Council meeting on Afghanistan, and the international community has spoken very loudly, including the representative Polyansky, who's the Deputy Ambassador to the United Nations from the Russian Federation.
Mr. Ossenkopp, beg your pardon for the interruption. We have seen international leaders speaking about this humanitarian crisis, but that has been more of a lip service rather than anything concrete that might be happening, because we have seen the things happening on the contrary, because the United States had frozen the funds, $9.5 billion, and there is no significant amount of aid that is being put in Afghanistan, so that there could be a sort of a resolution or a short-term or immediate resolution of the crisis over there.
I was going to come to that point because not only Russia, China, and other countries, but also Munir Akram, the ambassador of Pakistan, has spoken very, very strongly that these funds must be unfrozen, that the United States has no legal right to freeze Afghan money, which belongs to the Afghan people, and these are 9.5 billion US dollars, and there are also a number of, I think, a couple of $100 million frozen by European banks, but the biggest batch of it is frozen by the United States Ministry of Finance, the Federal Reserve. This is a major scandal. I mean, I'm part of an international institute called the Shiller Institute. We have made an appeal to the world community already at the end of last year, or the final quarter of last year, that this is not a way to handle the situation by collective punishment of the Afghan people. Yes, the NATO has suffered its severest defeat in history, probably, after 20 years of what they call a battle against terrorism and nation building, and they promised everyone that everything is going to be better when NATO countries are imposing their democratic values and their human rights issues on Afghanistan. And then all of a sudden, they are defeated by 75,000 Taliban fighters. They're retreating in a chaotic fashion, and they're leaving the country without any means of self-sufficiency. The Taliban are not to blame, as the Western media are often portraying the situation, not to blame for the situation on the ground right now. It's much
because
more complex.
corruption was rampant during the last 2 tenures of Ashraf Ghani's government as well as Hamid Karzai's government. Because the corruption was rampant, there was no system in place as far as the governance or the sustainable economic model is concerned. Nothing was done despite huge funds were given in by the international donors as well as the Western powers. I'll go to Mr. Yousaf. Mr. Yousaf, when it comes to international aid in order to help Afghanistan to avert the humanitarian crisis that it is faced with right now, there is another factor when we talk about Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan's statement that we should be exporting the trained and the skilled workers so that they can become the part of the public and the private sector in Afghanistan in order to help the system run on efficient and smooth lines. But there was an outcry on the social media from certain quarters in Afghanistan. Do you think that was justified?
I think it was not justified. I think people who visited Afghanistan after the Taliban takeover, they certainly lack skilled manpower, and many businesses and many government offices are now being run by Afghan Taliban, who for the last 20 years were virtually fighting a war with the US, and they do not have the experience to run the country, and certainly they need skilled manpower. And also don't forget that tens of thousands of people, after the chaotic exit of the US, Afghan skilled manpower actually opted to leave Afghanistan and settled in Europe and other countries. So certainly there is a huge a dearth of people over there in Afghanistan who need to, run the economy. So that the reaction is not justified. But let me add one thing. Of course, that we need to blame the international community and other players about what is happening in Afghanistan. I think the people of Afghanistan should also take the blame as well. One of the reasons that for the last 40 years Afghanistan has been at war because of the divisions within Afghanistan. The differences within Afghanistan, lack of unity, and even, when Ashraf Ghani was struggling to cling on power when Afghan Taliban were just outside Kabul, the US was trying to negotiate some kind of a deal. He did not agree. Even before that, they were trying. And because of these differences, I think the common Afghans are suffering. So if people of Afghanistan or whoever is running Afghanistan at the moment feel that the international community should come to their rescue, first of all, they need to have unity among their ranks. If they don't, I'm afraid that in a few months' time or a year time, I think the international community, particularly the West, will once again forget Afghanistan and their problems.
So, Mr. Hasan, what do you think? The outburst and the outcry over the social media regarding Pakistan's Prime Minister's proposal of sending in the skilled and those workers who could go and contribute over there. And basically, the idea behind this was the Pakistani authorities think that the people from Afghanistan who have been trained and have got the skill set over here and they've been educated over here in Pakistan, they should become the part of the Afghan system. And it will not only lessen the burden from Pakistan's resources, they will also help in contributing towards the economic revival of Afghanistan as well.
I think this is a misplaced outcry about this thing, because Afghanistan does need the capacity building and they need such skilled and trained people. And our foreign ministry also, from the Prime Minister's office also, it was clarified. It's not that Pakistani people will be going. The Afghans basically who trained here and who trained abroad can be used for the same purpose. Basically, I think a lot of people have left Afghanistan. The trained people, the skilled workers, they have left, they've gone out, and there is a shortage of people. So they do need such.
There's a shortage of skilled workers and the people who've been trained in Pakistan, and they should go and contribute over there for the revival of economy in Afghanistan. Mr. Azher Hasan, Air Vice Marshal retired, who is senior analyst. Thank you for your time at PTV World. And unfortunately, we are short of time. We'll have to end the discussion over here. Mr. Kamran Yousaf was with me on the phone line, who is a senior journalist, and Mr. Stephan Ossenkopp, geopolitical analyst and a research fellow at Shiller Institute, joining me on Skype from Berlin, Germany. Thank you, all of you, for your time at PTV World. With this, we come to the end of today's discussion. Until the next episode, it's goodbye.